April 25, 1945. The morning air in the small German town of Waldheim carried the distant rumble of artillery fire, a sound that had become as familiar as church bells once were. 14-year-old Albrecht Hartmann crouched in the cellar of what used to be the town's bakery, his hands trembling as he tried to load bullets into a rifle that was nearly as tall as he was. Around him, 6 other boys in tattered Hitler Youth uniforms performed the same ritual, their faces a mixture of determination and barely concealed terror. 16-year-old Wolfram Richter, the oldest among them and their self-appointed leader, paced back and forth across the dirt floor, his boots creating small clouds of dust with each step. He had received their orders just 2 hours earlier from a retreating Wehrmacht officer who looked more ghost than man. The instructions were simple and absolute. Hold this position, delay the American advance, and die with honor for the fatherland. Wolfram repeated these orders now, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to inject confidence into words that sounded hollow even to his own ears. Albrecht glanced at 11-year-old Clemens Fischer, the youngest of their group, who sat in the corner struggling to hold a rifle that seemed designed for someone twice his size. The boy's uniform hung loosely on his thin frame, and his face still carried the softness of childhood despite the grime and exhaustion etched into his features. Clemens had joined the Hitler Youth only 8 months earlier, eager to serve the Reich like his older brothers who had already died on the Eastern Front. Now he clutched his weapon with white-knuckled hands, his eyes wide with a fear he was too young to hide effectively. 13-year-old Gunther Moeller sat beside Albrecht, methodically checking and rechecking his ammunition count. Gunther had always been the practical one, the boy who asked uncomfortable questions about supply lines and strategic retreat when others spoke only of glorious last stands. But today, even Gunther was silent, his usual skepticism buried beneath the weight of their impossible situation. 12-year-old Eberhard Schneider had fallen asleep against the wall despite the approaching danger, his body too exhausted to maintain the vigilance fear demanded. 14-year-old Sigmund Koch stood at the narrow window that faced north, watching for signs of the American advance with the intensity of a true believer. 15-year-old Ruprecht Hoffmann, who just last week had been lecturing younger boys about the sacred duty of sacrifice, now sat cleaning his rifle with shaking hands. They had all been told the same stories. The Americans would show no mercy. They would torture German soldiers, especially young ones, to extract information. They would starve their prisoners deliberately, laughing as German boys begged for food. Death in battle was preferable to capture, their instructors had insisted. Better to die a hero than live as a victim of American brutality. Albrecht had believed these stories completely until this morning. Now, listening to the thunder of approaching tanks, he wondered if believing had ever really been a choice at all. The boys had been in the cellar for 3 days before receiving their final orders, surviving on stale bread and water from a cracked pipe in the corner. The basement smelled of mold and fear, a combination that had become so familiar that Albrecht barely noticed it anymore. What he did notice was how quiet everyone had become as the sounds of battle drew closer with each passing hour. Wolfram stood in the center of their makeshift bunker, attempting to rally spirits that had already begun to fracture. He recited the propaganda they had memorized in countless Hitler Youth meetings, his voice carrying the rehearsed passion of a true believer. The Führer was counting on them. Germany's future depended on their courage. Every minute they held this position would save countless German lives. The Americans expected to find frightened children, but they would discover warriors willing to die for their homeland. Albrecht watched Wolfram's performance and wondered if the older boy actually believed the words or if he was simply doing what was expected of leaders in their final moments. Clemens struggled with his rifle again, the barrel dipping toward the ground despite his best efforts to keep it raised. Gunther moved to help him, showing the younger boy how to brace the weapon against the wall for support. The gesture was practical but also kind, and Albrecht noticed how Clemens's eyes brightened slightly at this small act of care. They were still children, Albrecht realized, even dressed in uniforms and armed with weapons designed to kill. They still needed help, still craved the approval and assistance of those slightly older and more experienced. Eberhard had woken from his exhausted sleep and now sat checking his boots, which had holes in both soles. He had wrapped cloth around his feet to provide some protection, but Albrecht could see blood seeping through the makeshift bandages. A wound on Eberhard's left foot had become infected days ago, the red streaks of infection visible even in the dim cellar light. He needed a doctor, not a rifle. They all needed things that war could not provide. Sigmund remained at the window, providing periodic updates on the American advance. He spoke in the clipped, efficient tones of a soldier giving reconnaissance reports, as if mimicking adult military behavior could transform him into something more than a scared boy in an oversized uniform. Ruprecht had stopped cleaning his rifle and now simply held it across his lap, staring at nothing in particular. The 15-year-old who had spoken so confidently about glorious sacrifice now looked like what he was, a child facing his own mortality and finding the reality far different from the romantic propaganda. The rumbling grew louder, no longer distant thunder, but immediate presence. Tank engines, American voices, calling out in a language none of them fully understood. Wolfram ordered them to positions, his voice tight with tension. Albrecht took his assigned spot near the window, his heart hammering so violently he thought the Americans might hear it before they saw him. This was the moment they had been trained for, prepared for, promised would make them heroes. Instead, it felt like the end of everything. The first American tank rolled into view at exactly 11:23 in the morning, though Albrecht would not learn the precise time until years later when he read military reports about the capture of Waldheim. In that moment, time seemed to collapse into a single point of absolute terror. The massive vehicle crushed the remains of a garden fence as easily as if it were made of paper, its armored bulk filling the narrow street with mechanical menace. Wolfram shouted the order to fire, but his voice came out as more of a desperate plea than a military command. Albrecht raised his rifle toward the window, his hands shaking so badly he could barely aim. Beside him, Gunther squeezed off a shot that went wide, the bullet pinging harmlessly off the tank's armor. The return fire was immediate and overwhelming. Machine gun rounds tore through the upper portion of the building, sending chunks of brick and plaster raining down into the cellar. Clemens screamed and dropped his rifle, covering his head with his hands. Eberhard tried to stand, but his infected foot gave out beneath him, sending him sprawling across the dirt floor. American soldiers appeared in the street, moving with practiced efficiency that made the boys' amateur preparations look like children playing at war, which, Albrecht realized with sudden clarity, was exactly what they were. A voice called out in German, heavily accented but clear enough. "Come out with your hands up." "You will not be harmed," Wolfram screamed back defiance, ordering his small unit to fight, but Sigmund had already dropped his weapon and raised his hands. Ruprecht followed immediately after, then Eberhard, who could barely stand even with Gunther's help. Albrecht watched as his entire unit disintegrated in seconds. Only he, Wolfram, and young Clemens still held weapons, and Clemens was crying too hard to aim even if he had wanted to. The voice called out again, this time with more urgency but still no anger. They were surrounded. Resistance was pointless. They were children, and they would be treated as children, not soldiers. Something in that last phrase broke through Wolfram's determination. His face crumbled, the facade of leadership collapsing to reveal the frightened 16-year-old beneath. He dropped his rifle and raised his hands, his whole body shaking. Albrecht helped Clemens to his feet, taking the heavy rifle from the boy's trembling hands. Together they walked up the cellar stairs and out into the morning light, their hands raised high. American soldiers surrounded them immediately, but their weapons were lowered. They spoke in calm, almost gentle tones as they carefully searched each boy for additional weapons. When Gunther lost control of his bladder, leaving a dark stain spreading across his trousers, none of the Americans laughed or mocked him. Instead, one soldier offered him a canteen of water and a reassuring pat on the shoulder. They had been prepared for execution. Instead, they received kindness. It was more terrifying than any violence could have been. The march to the temporary holding area took approximately 20 minutes, though to Albrecht it felt like hours. American soldiers flanked the small group of boys on both sides, their weapons ready but not threatening. They passed through what remained of Waldheim's town square, where buildings the boys had known their entire lives now stood as burnt-out shells. An American military truck idled near the fountain that had somehow survived the battle, and soldiers leaned against it, smoking cigarettes and speaking in their strange, harsh-sounding language. Private Daniel Cooper, a lanky soldier who looked barely older than Wolfram, was assigned to escort the boys. He had sandy blonde hair and a sunburned face that made him look more like a farmhand than a conqueror. When Eberhard stumbled on his injured foot, Cooper immediately moved to support him, draping the boy's arm over his shoulder without hesitation. He spoke softly in English, his tone clearly meant to be comforting, even though none of the boys could understand his words. Albrecht found himself studying Cooper's face, searching for signs of the cruelty and sadism they had been promised all Americans possessed. The holding area was a converted schoolhouse that Albrecht recognized immediately. He had attended classes in this building just 3 years earlier, before education had been replaced entirely by military training and ideological instruction. The irony of being imprisoned in a place meant for learning was not lost on him. The Americans led them into what had been the gymnasium, where rough wooden benches had been arranged in rows. Several other German prisoners, all young boys, sat scattered throughout the space, their faces reflecting the same confusion and fear that Albrecht felt. Sergeant Thomas Martinez, a stocky man with dark hair and kind eyes, addressed the new arrivals in careful, practiced German. They would be held here temporarily while their identities were verified and their families located. They would receive food, water, and medical attention. They were not to attempt escape, but neither would they be mistreated. Any needs should be reported to the guards immediately. His words were professional, almost bureaucratic, but delivered with a gentleness that seemed completely at odds with everything the boys had been taught about American soldiers. Albrecht sat on a bench between Gunther and Clemens, his mind struggling to process what was happening. Cooper brought them more water and some hardtack biscuits, apologizing in English for not having better food immediately available. His apologetic tone needed no translation. Wolfram sat apart from the group, his face a mask of confusion and something that looked like shame. Siegmund kept his eyes downcast, unable or unwilling to look at their captors. Ruprecht whispered urgently to Eberhard, insisting that this kindness was merely a prelude to torture, that the Americans were simply lulling them into false security. But Albrecht watched Private Cooper laughing with another soldier, saw Sergeant Martinez helping an injured German boy to the makeshift medical station, observed the casual humanity in every interaction. These were not the monsters from propaganda posters. They were simply men, doing their jobs with a level of decency that contradicted everything he had been taught about the enemy. The gymnasium filled with more captured boys throughout the afternoon, until nearly 40 German youths sat on the wooden benches in various states of physical and emotional distress. The April sunlight streamed through the high windows, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air and casting long shadows across faces that had aged far beyond their years. Albrecht noticed how the light emphasized the hollow cheeks and sunken eyes of nearly every boy present, physical evidence of months or even years of inadequate nutrition. Eberhard sat with his injured foot elevated on a bench, the infected wound now bandaged by an American medic who had clucked his tongue disapprovingly while treating it. The 12-year-old's ribs were clearly visible through his thin undershirt, each bone distinct beneath skin that seemed stretched too tightly across his frame. He was not alone in his condition. Clemens looked like he might blow away in a strong wind, his uniform hanging on him like clothes on a scarecrow. Even Wolfram, who had always been strong and athletic, now appeared gaunt and depleted. Albrecht's own stomach had long since stopped growling with hunger, having passed into that strange state of numbness where the body simply accepted deprivation as normal. He could not remember the last time he had felt truly full. The Hitler youth rations had been meager even before the final collapse, and in the past weeks they had survived on whatever they could scavenge from abandoned buildings. Stale bread, wrinkled potatoes, once, memorably, a can of beans that 7 boys had shared among themselves, each precious spoonful treated like a feast. The other boys in the gymnasium told similar stories of hunger. A 13-year-old from Stuttgart spoke of eating grass and tree bark when nothing else could be found. 2 brothers from Munich described watching their mother trade her wedding ring for a loaf of bread, only to give most of it to her sons. A 15-year-old from Hamburg mentioned almost casually that 3 members of his unit had died from starvation-related illness before they ever encountered Allied forces. Hunger had been as much their enemy as any soldier. Gunther whispered to Albrecht, asking when the Americans would begin the starvation they had been warned about. According to their training, prisoners were deliberately denied food as both punishment and interrogation technique. The Americans would wait until the boys were desperate, then offer sustenance in exchange for information or cooperation. Albrecht had no answer, but he noticed that several hours had passed since their capture and no one had mentioned food at all. Perhaps the Americans were waiting for them to beg first, he thought. Or perhaps they were simply enjoying the psychological torture of making their prisoners wonder when the deprivation would begin. Young Clemens had curled up on a bench, his body instinctively trying to conserve energy that no longer existed. Siegmund sat with his arms wrapped around his thin torso, as if trying to hold himself together through sheer will. Ruprecht stared at the floor, his earlier defiance replaced by hollow-eyed resignation. They were children who had forgotten what it felt like not to be hungry, waiting in an enemy prison for suffering they had been promised was inevitable. The American soldiers arrived at 1700 hours, carrying large metal containers that steamed in the cooling evening air. Private Cooper led the group, followed by 3 other soldiers pushing a wheeled cart loaded with stacks of metal bowls and spoons. The gymnasium fell silent as every boy watched this procession with wary, uncomprehending eyes. Albrecht felt his heart rate accelerate, uncertain whether this development represented something good or something terrible disguised as kindness. Sergeant Martinez stood before the assembled prisoners and announced in his careful German that dinner was being served. The words seemed impossible, contradicting every expectation the boys had carried into captivity. Wolfram immediately stood and declared in a loud voice that they should refuse whatever was offered, that accepting enemy food was a form of collaboration. Several boys nodded agreement, though their eyes remained fixed on the steaming containers with an intensity that betrayed their hunger. Private Cooper began ladling soup into bowls, the rich aroma filling the gymnasium with scents that made Albrecht's mouth water involuntarily. He could identify vegetables, meat, and herbs in that smell, ingredients that had become almost mythical in their scarcity. Real food, hot and abundant, being offered freely to enemy prisoners. It seemed like an elaborate dream, or perhaps a cruel hallucination brought on by malnutrition. Yet the bowls kept filling, and American soldiers kept distributing them to boys who accepted them with trembling hands. Clemens received his bowl first, being youngest and nearest to the distribution point. He stared at the contents with wide eyes, tears beginning to stream down his dirty cheeks. The soup was thick with chunks of potato, carrot, and what appeared to be actual beef. More food sat in that single bowl than Clemens had seen in weeks. He looked up at Private Cooper with an expression of such desperate hope and confusion that the American soldier's own eyes grew moist. Cooper gestured for the boy to eat, his meaning clear, despite the language barrier. Wolfram moved to intercept Clemens, still insisting the food might be poisoned or drugged, but hunger overrode caution and ideology. Clemens brought the spoon to his lips and tasted the soup, and his face transformed with an emotion that was almost painful to witness. He began eating with desperate speed, burning his mouth in his eagerness, tears mixing with the soup as he consumed it. Around the gymnasium, other boys faced the same impossible choice between ideological purity and physical survival. Survival won. Albrecht accepted his bowl from Private Cooper, meeting the American's eyes briefly. He saw no malice there, no mockery, only a kind of sad understanding. The soup was hot and rich, filled with more nutrients than his body had processed in months. He ate slowly, forcing himself not to gulp it down like Clemens was doing, but savoring each spoonful as if it might be his last. Gunther ate beside him, silent tears running down his face. Even Wolfram eventually accepted a bowl, though he ate alone in the corner, his back to the others, as if ashamed of his surrender to hunger. The aftermath of the meal left the boys in a state of confused lethargy, their bodies struggling to process more food than they had consumed in days. Albrecht sat with his empty bowl in his lap, feeling simultaneously satisfied and guilty for that satisfaction. Around him, other boys exhibited similar emotional conflict, caught between gratitude for the unexpected kindness and shame at accepting comfort from the enemy. The rigid certainties that had sustained them through capture were beginning to crack, and what lay beneath was far more complicated than simple hatred or fear. Private Cooper moved through the gymnasium, collecting empty bowls, and when he reached Albrecht, the young American paused and attempted conversation. His German was limited to a few basic phrases learned from a handbook, but he gestured to the bowl and asked if the food was good. Albrecht nodded, then surprised himself by whispering, "Donkey," in response. The word felt like betrayal even as it left his mouth, gratitude toward an enemy soldier who had shown him unexpected humanity. Cooper smiled, a genuine expression of pleasure at having helped, and moved on to collect Gunther's bowl. Other American soldiers began engaging with the German boys in similar fashion, using gestures and simple words to bridge the language gap. Sergeant Martinez sat with a group of younger prisoners, showing them photographs of his own children back in Texas. The boys studied the images with fascination, seeing American children who looked remarkably similar to themselves engaged in ordinary activities like playing baseball and attending school. These were the families of monsters, according to propaganda, yet the photographs showed only normalcy and happiness. Gunther, emboldened by Cooper's friendliness, attempted his own conversation in broken English, learned from a book his father had owned before it was confiscated. He managed to convey that he was 13 years old and from a town near Munich. Cooper responded with information about his own background, speaking slowly and using hand gestures to aid understanding. He came from a farm in Nebraska, had 3 sisters, and missed his family's Sunday dinners more than anything else about home. The conversation was halting and imperfect, but it represented something unprecedented in the boy's experience. Ruprecht watched these interactions with visible distress, as if witnessing the dissolution of everything he believed provided order and meaning to the world. He whispered urgently to Sigmund that this was psychological warfare, a deliberate attempt to weaken their resolve and turn them into collaborators. But Sigmund was watching Eberhard receive medical attention from an American medic who treated the infected foot wound with supplies that German forces had long since exhausted. The care was professional and gentle, accompanied by reassuring words in accented German explaining each step of the treatment. Albrecht observed all of this with a mind that felt like it was being pulled apart. Every interaction contradicted his training. Every kindness challenged his understanding of who the enemy was supposed to be. He thought about the propaganda films he had watched, showing brutal American soldiers laughing while German prisoners suffered. He thought about the lectures describing Americans as culturally inferior and morally bankrupt. Then he looked at Private Cooper helping Clemens fold a blanket, demonstrating the proper technique with patient good humor, and wondered how many other lies he had been taught to believe. Army medic James Mitchell had served in North Africa and Italy before arriving in Germany, and he had seen enough suffering to last several lifetimes. But nothing had quite prepared him for the condition of the German boys now under his care. At 32 years old, he was older than most of the soldiers in his unit, and his experiences as a father to 2 young sons back in Pennsylvania made it impossible to see these prisoners as anything other than somebody's children who desperately needed help. He moved through the gymnasium with his medical kit, conducting examinations that revealed the extent of neglect and deprivation these boys had endured. Malnutrition was universal among them, ranging from moderate to severe. Many had untreated wounds that had become infected due to lack of proper medical supplies. Several showed signs of frostbite damage from winter exposure. One boy had a broken finger that had healed incorrectly because no one had set it properly. Mitchell worked methodically, treating each patient with the same careful attention he would give his own sons. When he reached Eberhard Schneider, Mitchell's professional demeanor cracked slightly. The 12-year-old's foot wound was badly infected, red streaks of blood poisoning visible up his calf. Left untreated for perhaps another day or two, the infection could have spread to lethal proportions. Mitchell cleaned the wound with antiseptic, speaking softly in the few German words he knew to warn the boy before each potentially painful procedure. Eberhard bit his lip to keep from crying out, maintaining the stoic facade he had been taught was proper for a German soldier. Mitchell noticed the boy's restraint and shook his head, speaking in English that his translator later converted to German. "You don't have to be brave right now. You're allowed to say when something hurts." The permission to acknowledge pain seemed to surprise Eberhard more than the treatment itself. He had been taught that admitting discomfort was weakness, that German youth must endure suffering without complaint. But here was an enemy soldier telling him the opposite, giving him permission to be a child who could express when he was hurting. As Mitchell bandaged the cleaned wound, he explained each step of the process through his translator. The infection would need several days of treatment with sulfa drugs. The wound would heal, but Eberhard needed rest and proper nutrition to help his body fight the infection. He should report immediately if the pain worsened or if he developed a fever. Mitchell's tone was professional but warm, the voice of a caregiver rather than a captor. He finished by giving Eberhard 2 small white pills and a cup of water, instructing him to take the medication twice daily. Other boys watched this interaction with varying expressions of confusion and hope. They had never experienced adult care delivered with such gentleness. Their own officers had been harsh taskmasters who viewed complaints about injury or illness as character defects. Their families, struggling to survive in wartime conditions, had often lacked the resources to provide adequate medical care. Now, in enemy captivity, they were receiving treatment that exceeded anything available to them in their own country, and the cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. Night fell on the gymnasium, but sleep eluded most of the boys despite their exhaustion. They lay on thin mattresses that American soldiers had distributed, each boy wrapped in a wool blanket that smelled of military storage and represented more comfort than many had experienced in months. The building was dark, except for the moonlight streaming through high windows and the dim glow of lanterns that guards maintained throughout the night. Whispered conversations in German filled the space as boys processed the day's impossible events. Albrecht lay between Gunther and Clemens, staring at the ceiling and trying to reconcile everything he had witnessed with everything he had been taught. The Americans had fed them substantial meals, provided medical care, and treated them with a gentleness that contradicted every aspect of their training. They had been warned that capture meant torture, starvation, and eventually execution. Instead, they had received soup, medicine, and blankets. The disparity between expectation and reality was so complete that it called into question every other belief he held. Gunther whispered urgently in the darkness, asking questions that neither of them could answer. If the Americans were as brutal as propaganda claimed, why show kindness now? If they planned to torture information from prisoners, why waste medical supplies healing their wounds? If German forces were truly superior in every way, why did American soldiers have abundant food and medicine while German children went hungry and untreated? Each question chipped away at the foundation of certainty that Nazi ideology had constructed in their minds. Wolfram overheard their whispered conversation and hissed a warning from his nearby mattress. They were being manipulated, he insisted. The Americans were softening them up for interrogation, making them grateful and compliant so they would betray German military secrets. Except none of them knew any secrets worth protecting. They were children who had been handed rifles and pointed toward the enemy with minimal training and no strategic knowledge. What information could they possibly possess that would justify this elaborate deception? Clemens began to cry quietly in the darkness, and Albrecht reached out to pat the younger boy's shoulder in awkward comfort. The 11-year-old whispered that he missed his mother, that he was confused and frightened, that nothing made sense anymore. His honest vulnerability echoed what many of them felt but were too proud or too afraid to express. They had been taught that German youth must be hard and unyielding, but that teaching had left them unprepared for situations requiring emotional flexibility and moral nuance. Sigmund sat up on his mattress, his voice carrying across the dark gymnasium as he posed the question they were all avoiding. What if everything they had been told about Americans was wrong? What if the propaganda had been lies designed to keep them fighting for a cause that was already lost? The silence that followed his words was heavy with implication. If that one thing was false, what else might be untrue? The Hitler Youth teachings? The promises of German superiority? The righteousness of their cause? Once doubt entered their minds, it spread like infection through previously certain beliefs. Morning arrived with weak sunlight and the smell of coffee brewing somewhere in the building, an aroma so rich and unfamiliar that several boys thought they were still dreaming. American soldiers moved through the gymnasium, rousing prisoners for breakfast, their voices cheerful in a way that seemed almost obscene given the circumstances. The boys shuffled to the mess area, where they received porridge with milk and sugar, bread with butter, and hot coffee or tea. Each meal seemed designed to demonstrate the vast disparity between American abundance and German scarcity. After breakfast, Sergeant Martinez made an announcement that sent ripples of complicated emotion through the assembled prisoners. The International Red Cross was helping to establish contact with families in Germany. Each boy would be given paper and pencil to write letters that would be forwarded through official channels. The letters might take weeks or even months to reach their destinations, and responses could not be guaranteed given the chaos of post-war Germany. But the attempt would be made. For many boys, this represented the first opportunity to communicate with their families since capture or even longer. Albrecht sat at a wooden table with blank paper before him, trying to compose a letter to his mother in Berlin. He knew the city had been heavily bombed, but he had no way of knowing if his family's apartment building still stood or if his mother had survived. He began writing carefully, keeping his message simple and hopeful. He was alive and unharmed, being held by American forces, receiving adequate food and medical care. He asked about her health, about his younger sister Greta, about whether their home had survived the bombing. He did not mention the confusion churning inside him or the way his certainties had begun to dissolve. Gunther wrote to his grandmother in a village outside Munich, the only family member whose location he knew with certainty. His parents had been killed in a bombing raid the previous year, and his grandmother had raised him since. He described his capture and current conditions, trying to strike a tone that would reassure her without revealing the psychological turmoil he was experiencing. He asked her to write back if she received the letter, to tell him if she was safe and had enough to eat. The act of writing made his situation feel more real somehow, transforming abstract captivity into concrete separation from people he loved. Clemens struggled with his letter, his handwriting still bearing the careful loops of recent elementary school instruction. He wrote to both parents, uncertain whether either had survived. His father had been drafted into the Volkssturm, the desperate last mobilization of elderly men and boys, and sent to defend Berlin. His mother had remained in their small town with Clemens's 3 younger siblings. The 11-year-old described the Americans with wonder, mentioning the soup and medicine and blankets in terms that suggested he could barely believe his own words. He ended by saying he hoped to see them all soon, though when or where or how remained completely uncertain. Wolfram sat apart from the others, his letter brief and formal. He provided only essential information about his location and status, refusing to describe his treatment in any detail that might suggest he had been compromised by enemy kindness. The 3rd day of their captivity began like the previous ones, with breakfast and the now familiar routine of American efficiency and unexpected kindness. But at mid-morning, Sergeant Martinez entered the gymnasium carrying a leather folder under his arm, his expression more serious than usual. He asked for all the boys to gather in the center of the space, his tone suggesting this was not a routine announcement. Albrecht felt anxiety tighten in his chest as he joined the semicircle forming around the sergeant. Martinez spoke slowly and clearly in German, choosing his words with obvious care. What he was about to show them was disturbing and difficult, but it was important they understood the truth about what had been happening in their own country. The folder contained photographs taken by Allied forces as they liberated concentration camps across Germany and Poland. He wanted them to see these images not as punishment, but as truth, as evidence of realities they needed to confront. He paused, asking if they understood and were prepared to see difficult things. Wolfram immediately protested, declaring loudly that everyone knew American propaganda included fabricated photographs designed to demoralize German prisoners and turn them against their own nation. Several boys nodded agreement, clinging to this explanation before they had even seen the images. But Martinez shook his head sadly and explained that these photographs had been verified by multiple international observers, including Swiss Red Cross representatives. The images were real, the situations they depicted had truly occurred, and denying their existence would not make them disappear. He began showing the photographs one by one, and the gymnasium fell into horrified silence. The images were grainy, black and white, but their content was unmistakable. Rows of emaciated bodies stacked like firewood. Living skeletons staring at cameras with hollow eyes that had witnessed unimaginable suffering. Children, not much younger than Clemens, reduced to bare bones covered by skin. Mass graves filled with thousands of victims, German soldiers and civilians being forced to witness and bury the dead they had helped create through action or complicity. Albrecht stared at the photographs with growing horror, his mind rejecting what his eyes were seeing. These could not be real. Germany would not do such things. They were defending their homeland, fighting for their survival, not murdering innocent people in organized, systematic fashion. But the images kept coming, each one more devastating than the last. Photographs of gas chambers disguised as shower rooms, mountains of shoes and eyeglasses taken from victims, children's toys piled beside crematorium ovens. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. Gunther turned away and vomited, his breakfast returning violently as his body rejected what his mind could not process. Other boys began crying, their faces reflecting shock and disbelief. Clemens asked in a small voice if the people in the photographs were Jews, and when Martinez confirmed this, along with other groups targeted by Nazi policies, the 11-year-old began to sob. He remembered the Jewish family that had lived in his building, how they had disappeared one night 3 years ago, how his mother had told him not to ask questions about where they had gone. The photographs remained spread across a table in the gymnasium, unavoidable evidence of horrors that could not be unseen or forgotten. The boys sat in scattered groups, some crying openly, while others stared into space with expressions of numb shock. Wolfram had retreated to a corner, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking with sobs he tried unsuccessfully to suppress. The certainty that had sustained him through capture had shattered completely, leaving only devastating confusion about everything he thought he knew. Albrecht found himself remembering specific moments from his childhood with new and terrible clarity. The Jewish shopkeeper who had always given him extra candy, whose store had been smashed during Kristallnacht when Albrecht was 7 years old. The teacher at his school who had disappeared without explanation, and how the other teachers had warned students never to mention her name again. His neighbor, Frau Goldstein, who had worn a yellow star, and then one day was simply gone, her apartment occupied by a party official within the week. He had been taught that these people were enemies of Germany, threats to national security who needed to be removed for the protection of German citizens. He had accepted these explanations without question because questioning was not permitted and because he was a child who believed adults told the truth. But the photographs showed something far beyond removal or relocation. They showed systematic murder on a scale so vast it seemed almost impossible for human beings to have organized and executed. Yet Germans had done exactly that. Gunther sat beside Albrecht, his voice barely a whisper, as he asked the question that haunted them all. Were we part of this? By serving in the Hitler Youth, by believing what they told us, by not asking questions, were we part of making this happen? Albrecht had no answer, because the truth was too painful to speak aloud. They had been children, yes, but children who had participated enthusiastically in a system that led directly to the horrors in those photographs. Their ignorance did not erase their complicity. An American chaplain arrived that afternoon, a German-American priest named Father Otto Reinhardt, who had volunteered specifically to work with German prisoners. He was perhaps 50 years old, with gray hair and eyes that reflected deep sadness born from witnessing human capacity for both good and evil. He spoke to the assembled boys in fluent German, his accent carrying traces of Bavaria, though he had lived in America for 30 years. He did not sugarcoat what they had seen or offer easy comfort. Father Reinhardt explained that he had visited the liberated camps himself, had spoken with survivors, had helped bury the dead. Everything in the photographs was real and represented only a fraction of the total horror. Millions had died in these camps: Jews, Roma, political prisoners, disabled people, homosexuals, anyone the regime deemed unworthy of life. The scale of murder was so vast that historians would spend decades attempting to document it fully. This was not enemy propaganda. This was German reality. The boys reacted with varying degrees of acceptance and denial. Sigmund insisted he had never known about the camps, had never been told about systematic murder. Father Reinhardt nodded sympathetically, but pointed out that many Germans had chosen not to know, had deliberately avoided asking questions about where their neighbors disappeared to or what happened in the camps everyone whispered about, but no one discussed openly. Ignorance could be chosen, and chosen ignorance carried its own burden of responsibility. The days following the revelation of the photographs were marked by a heavy depression that settled over the gymnasium like fog. Many boys withdrew into themselves, speaking little and eating mechanically when meals were provided. But Private Daniel Cooper and other American soldiers seemed to recognize that the German prisoners needed something beyond food and shelter. They needed reasons to remember they were still human beings capable of goodness, still children who deserved moments of simple joy despite the weight of history pressing down on them. Cooper arrived one morning carrying a makeshift baseball bat carved from a piece of wood and a ball made from tightly wrapped cloth and string. He approached Albrecht, who sat alone near a window, and gestured for the 14-year-old to follow him outside to a small courtyard behind the building. Through a mixture of gestures and simple German words, Cooper indicated he wanted to teach Albrecht an American game. The absurdity of playing while the world lay in ruins seemed almost offensive at first, but something in Cooper's earnest enthusiasm made refusal seem churlish. Cooper demonstrated how to hold the bat, how to swing at the thrown ball, how to run imaginary bases marked by stones placed in the dirt. His patience was remarkable, as Albrecht repeatedly missed the ball or hit it weakly in wrong directions. But gradually, after perhaps 20 minutes of practice, Albrecht made solid contact and the ball sailed across the courtyard. Cooper cheered as if witnessing a great athletic achievement, and despite everything, Albrecht felt a small spark of pleasure at having succeeded at this pointless but engaging activity. Other boys drifted outside to watch, drawn by curiosity and the sound of Cooper's encouraging shouts. Soon Gunther was taking his turn at bat while Clemens retrieved missed balls. Even Eberhard, still hobbling on his healing foot, participated by keeping score using a system Cooper taught him. The game had simple rules that required no shared language, only willingness to engage. For brief moments, the courtyard filled with shouts and laughter that sounded almost normal, almost like children playing instead of prisoners trying to process unimaginable horror. Sergeant Martinez organized other activities throughout the week. Card games became popular entertainment during evening hours, with Americans teaching German boys poker while learning scat in return. One soldier who played harmonica gave informal concerts that drew audiences from both captors and captives. Another brought a soccer ball that sparked competitive matches between mixed teams of Americans and Germans, barriers of nationality dissolving temporarily in the pursuit of goals and victories that meant nothing and everything simultaneously. These activities did not erase the boys' knowledge of the camps or resolve their moral crisis about their own complicity. But they provided moments of respite from constant anguish, reminders that life contained possibilities beyond guilt and grief. Albrecht found himself laughing genuinely at one of Cooper's terrible jokes, then immediately feeling ashamed for experiencing happiness when millions had died. But Cooper seemed to understand, placing a hand on Albrecht's shoulder and speaking words that needed no translation. It was acceptable to still be alive, to still find moments of lightness. The dead did not require the living to suffer endlessly in penance. By the end of their second week in American custody, word arrived that procedures were being established for repatriation. German prisoners would be processed through displaced persons camps, their identities verified, and their families located if possible. Those with confirmed homes and family members would be returned to Germany within months. The announcement should have brought relief, but instead it triggered a new wave of anxiety among the boys who were no longer certain what they wanted or where they belonged. Reports from Germany painted a picture of almost incomprehensible devastation. Berlin lay in ruins, with Soviet forces occupying the eastern sectors, and reports of widespread violence against remaining German civilians. Hamburg, Dresden, and Munich had been bombed repeatedly, their historic centers reduced to rubble. Millions of Germans were homeless, surviving in makeshift shelters without adequate food, water, or sanitation. The country they had believed in no longer existed in any recognizable form, replaced by occupied zones controlled by victorious powers. More disturbing were reports about how returning German soldiers were being received by their own people. Those who had surrendered rather than fighting to the death were sometimes viewed with contempt, accused of betraying the fatherland through their survival. Women and children associated with military families faced particular hardships, blamed for supporting a regime whose crimes were now becoming public knowledge. The boys worried about what reception awaited them, whether their families would welcome them or view them as shameful reminders of national defeat. Albrecht had received no response to his letter home, which could mean his mother never received it, could not respond, or was no longer alive to do so. The uncertainty was agonizing. He found himself imagining worst-case scenarios: his mother dead in the bombing, his sister starving in ruins, his entire family erased, while he sat safe in American custody, eating regular meals. The guilt of survival mixed toxically with fear of return, creating emotional paralysis that made any decision feel impossible. Gunther had received a brief letter from his grandmother confirming she was alive, but reporting that their village had been heavily damaged and food was desperately scarce. She was living with neighbors whose home had partially survived, sharing one room with 6 other displaced people. She wanted him to return when possible, but warned that conditions were terrible and likely to worsen before improving. Her letter was loving but realistic, offering no false comfort about what awaited him in post-war Germany. The boys gathered in small groups to discuss their impossible situation. Return meant facing devastation, potential hostility, and the burden of living in a country that had committed atrocities they could never forget or fully comprehend. But staying in American custody indefinitely seemed equally impossible. They were prisoners of war, not immigrants, and international law required their repatriation. Several boys expressed wishes that they could somehow remain in America, start new lives free from the weight of German history, but such fantasies seemed hopelessly unrealistic. Clemens asked Albrecht what he planned to do, and the 14-year-old realized he had no answer. Every option carried unbearable costs. He was caught between a past that horrified him and a future that offered no clear path forward, suspended in a present where American soldiers treated him with kindness he was not certain he deserved. Private Cooper found Albrecht sitting alone in the courtyard one afternoon, the boy's posture suggesting he carried weight far heavier than his thin frame should bear. Cooper sat beside him without speaking, following his grandmother's wisdom that sometimes presence mattered more than words. They remained in companionable silence for several minutes before Albrecht spoke in his improving English, the words coming slowly as he searched for proper phrasing to express complicated emotions. He tried to thank Cooper for the kindness shown to him and the other boys. The food, the medical care, the baseball games, all of it contradicted everything he had been taught about Americans and represented mercy he felt he did not deserve. Albrecht's voice broke as he attempted to explain how the soup that first evening had changed something fundamental in his understanding of the world. He had expected death or suffering and received sustenance instead, a reversal so complete it had shattered his certainty about which side represented good and which evil. Cooper listened without interruption, his young face serious as he tried to understand both the words and the emotion behind them. When Albrecht finished, Cooper spoke slowly, in his own halting German, wanting to ensure his meaning was clear. He explained that he had joined the army believing Germans were monsters who needed to be defeated. But when he saw boys like Albrecht, thin, scared, injured children who had been used by adults pursuing evil purposes, his understanding had shifted as well. These were not monsters, but victims of a different kind. Albrecht shook his head, insisting that he bore responsibility for his participation, even if he had been young and misled. He had believed the propaganda enthusiastically, had been proud to serve the Hitler Youth, had looked forward to the day he would be old enough to join the Wehrmacht properly. He had cheered when Jewish families in his neighborhood were removed, had participated in book burnings, had reported a teacher he suspected of insufficient loyalty to party officials. The fact that he was a child when he did these things did not erase the harm caused. Cooper's response was gentle but firm. Responsibility existed on a spectrum, he suggested. Adult leaders who designed and implemented systematic murder bore primary guilt. Adults who participated directly in atrocities bore significant guilt. But children who believed what they were taught by trusted authority figures bore a different, lesser burden. Acknowledging that burden was important, Albrecht's willingness to confront his own complicity, rather than deny it, demonstrated moral courage. But drowning in guilt without moving toward some kind of redemption served no one, neither the living nor the dead. The conversation shifted to questions about what redemption might mean. Cooper suggested it involved learning from horror rather than repeating it, treating others with the dignity that had been denied to millions, and building a different kind of future. Albrecht could not undo the past or bring back the dead, but he could choose what kind of person he became going forward. That choice, Cooper insisted, mattered more than any mistake made by a child who knew nothing beyond what he had been taught. The gymnasium that had housed 40 German boys for nearly 3 weeks now contained a fractured community, divided not by force, but by fundamentally different responses to their shared experiences. Some boys clung desperately to remnants of Nazi ideology, unable or unwilling to accept that everything they believed had been founded on lies. Others, like Albrecht and Gunther, had begun the painful process of reconstructing their understanding of reality from shattered foundations. The division created tension that American guards watched carefully, concerned about potential violence between prisoners with opposing viewpoints. Wolfram had emerged from his initial breakdown with renewed certainty that paradoxically made him more isolated. He insisted the photographs were propaganda, that German actions had been justified, defense against enemies seeking to destroy their nation, that admitting guilt meant betraying those who had died for the Reich. He spoke to younger boys like Clemens, trying to convince them that American kindness was manipulation designed to break their spirits. His arguments found little traction among prisoners whose empty stomachs had been filled and whose wounds had been healed by the very enemies he insisted were irredeemably evil. Sigmund had taken a different path, withdrawing into sullen silence that suggested neither acceptance nor denial, but rather complete confusion. He ate the meals provided, participated mechanically in daily routines, and avoided conversations that touched on anything deeper than immediate practical concerns. His face had become a mask, revealing nothing of whatever turmoil existed beneath. Several boys adopted similar strategies, choosing numbness over the pain of confronting difficult truths about themselves and their country. But others embraced transformation with an intensity that suggested desperate need for redemption. Eberhard, whose infected foot had been saved by American medical care, began helping Medic Mitchell with daily sick calls, learning basic first aid techniques and English medical terminology. He spoke openly about wanting to become a doctor after the war, to heal rather than harm, to make some small amends for having been part of a system that caused such suffering. Mitchell encouraged this ambition, seeing genuine calling in the 12-year-old's gentle competence with injured patients. Gunther spent hours in conversation with Sergeant Martinez, asking questions about American government, society, and values. He wanted to understand how a country functioned when it was built on principles of individual rights rather than racial hierarchy, when disagreement was permitted rather than punished, when leaders were accountable to citizens rather than demanding absolute obedience. Martinez answered patiently, explaining American democracy with its flaws and strengths, painting a picture of imperfect society striving toward ideals it did not always meet, but at least acknowledged as worthy goals. Clemens attached himself to Private Cooper with the desperate affection of a child seeking a father figure. His own father remained missing, likely dead in Berlin's final defense, and the 11-year-old needed someone to represent safety and care. Cooper accepted this role with grace, teaching Clemens English words, showing him card tricks, and providing the kind of casual affection that reminded the boy he was still a child deserving of protection rather than a soldier bearing adult responsibilities. Albrecht watched these different responses and recognized that each boy was finding his own way through trauma toward whatever future seemed possible. There was no single correct path through the wreckage of their previous certainties, only individual choices about what to carry forward and what to leave behind. By late May, repatriation procedures had solidified into concrete timelines. The boys would be transferred to a larger displaced persons camp in Frankfurt within 2 weeks, where they would undergo final processing before being returned to Germany. The announcement brought mixed reactions: relief at having a definite plan, anxiety about leaving the relative safety of American custody, and grief at ending relationships formed during their captivity. Albrecht realized with surprise that he would miss Private Cooper and the other soldiers who had treated him with unexpected humanity. The final weeks took on a quality of borrowed time, each day precious because it represented one fewer opportunity to learn from the Americans who had shown them a different way of being. The boys absorbed lessons, both explicit and implicit, about how to treat others with dignity, how to question authority without losing sense of community, how to acknowledge mistakes without being destroyed by shame. These were skills that Nazi ideology had deliberately suppressed, teaching instead blind obedience and tribal hatred. Unlearning such deep conditioning would take years, but the foundation was being established. Eberhard's transformation had been perhaps the most visible. The quiet 12-year-old who had arrived with an infected foot and hopeless eyes now moved through the gymnasium with purpose, assisting Medic Mitchell and speaking confidently about his future plans. Mitchell had given him a basic medical textbook in German, obtained through military channels, and Eberhard studied it during every spare moment. He practiced bandaging techniques on willing volunteers, memorized anatomical terminology, and asked questions that revealed genuine intellectual curiosity. The medic told him repeatedly that he had natural talent for healing work, encouragement that Eberhard absorbed like plants absorb sunlight. Gunther had filled a notebook with observations about American democracy, creating a self-directed civics education that Sergeant Martinez supplemented with recommended readings from military library resources. The 13-year-old was constructing a framework for understanding how societies could function without authoritarian control, how disagreement could coexist with unity, how freedom and responsibility balanced each other. He spoke of wanting to help rebuild Germany along different principles, though he had only vague ideas about how one person could influence national transformation. Martinez encouraged these ambitions while cautioning that change would be slow and difficult. Clemens had learned enough English to hold simple conversations with Private Cooper, their communication a mixture of both languages that represented bridge building in miniature. The 11-year-old still cried sometimes for his missing father and uncertain future, but he also laughed at Cooper's jokes and played baseball with increasing skill. He had discovered that carrying grief did not require abandoning all joy, that honoring the dead meant living fully rather than suffering endlessly. This wisdom seemed impossibly mature for his age, but trauma often accelerated emotional development in ways both beneficial and costly. Albrecht had spent weeks in intensive reflection, writing long entries in a diary that Private Cooper had given him. He documented everything: the capture, the soup, the photographs, the conversations that had changed his understanding of the world. He wrote about guilt and responsibility, about the difference between child and adult culpability, about the possibility of redemption through future actions rather than past mistakes. His writing was therapy and testimony, personal processing, and historical record for a future he could barely imagine. 23 years after that April day in 1945, when German child soldiers expected starvation and received hot soup instead, Albrecht Hartmann stood before a classroom of West German students in a rebuilt Hamburg gymnasium. He was 37 years old now, a history teacher who specialized in confronting his nation's difficult past with honesty that remained controversial even 2 decades after the war's end. Some parents complained he was too harsh on Germany, dwelling unnecessarily on crimes that younger generations should not be forced to bear. Others praised his willingness to teach truth rather than comfortable myths. On his desk sat a faded photograph from 1945 showing 7 thin German boys sitting with American soldiers, metal bowls of soup in their hands. The image had been taken by a military photographer documenting unusual aspects of the occupation, never imagining it would become a teaching tool decades later. Albrecht used this photograph to begin every school year, asking his students what they saw in those young faces: the confusion, the fear, the hesitant hope that kindness might be real rather than cruel trick. He told them his story without embellishment or false heroism. He had been a child soldier who believed Nazi propaganda completely, who wore his Hitler Youth uniform with pride, who expected to die defending a regime that had committed unprecedented evil. He described the capture, the terror of facing enemies he had been taught were monsters. Then he described the soup, hot, nourishing, freely given to boys who had been prepared for execution. That moment, he told his students, had been the beginning of his education in actual human values as opposed to ideological distortions. His students listened with varying degrees of engagement. Some were genuinely moved by his testimony. Others seemed uncomfortable with his insistence that ordinary Germans bore responsibility for having supported or enabled the regime, even if they had not directly participated in atrocities. A few challenged his narrative, suggesting that focusing on Allied kindness ignored the suffering caused by bombing German cities. Albrecht welcomed these challenges, believing that honest disagreement was healthier than enforced consensus or historical denial. He explained that acknowledging American kindness did not erase Allied bombing campaigns or other wartime actions that caused German suffering. History contained multiple simultaneous truths. Germany had initiated aggressive war and committed systematic genocide. Allied forces had responded with actions that killed many German civilians. Individual American soldiers had shown mercy to child prisoners. All these facts coexisted, and understanding required holding complexity rather than retreating into simplistic narratives that made one side entirely good and the other entirely evil. The photograph remained on his desk throughout the year, a reminder that transformation was possible even in the darkest circumstances. When he felt discouraged by students who resisted confronting difficult history, he remembered Private Cooper teaching him baseball, Medic Mitchell saving Eberhard's foot, Sergeant Martinez patiently explaining democracy. These men had chosen to see children rather than enemies, had offered second chances that changed lives. Albrecht dedicated his teaching career to extending that same generosity to new generations, helping them understand their history without being crushed by it, preparing them to build something better from the ruins of the past.